Welcome to Beyond the Platform. I'm your host, Tony Montgomery, and with us today we have Dr. Scott Stevenson. To get a quick bio on him, you can go back to the first podcast we did together. He is the founder of Fortitude Training, and he has that book, and also Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach is another great book full of resources and references. And if you want to check out any of his stuff, you can go to, is it just drscottstevenson.com and fortitudetraining.com?
fortitudetraining.net. You can just Google Scott Stevenson bodybuilding. It all comes up. There's almost should be a barrier to entry. If you can't find me online, then don't even come, because I'm so easy to find,
Yeah, no, I agree. And he has his own podcast on Advices Radio, Muscle Minds, which is a great podcast if you want to go into deep dives. And he also does Q&A on there as well. So one of the most informative podcasts you'll find on the internet, in my opinion.
Oh, thanks, man.
You're welcome, sir. And so I just wanted to have you on because there's always a lot of conversation on is periodization worth looking into for hypertrophy? Because the concept of periodization was built out through sports models and mostly through the Olympic model of a 4-year track to make sure that person peaks at the Olympics. And then it's also brought down now to a yearly model for athletes getting ready for whether it be the NFL or baseball season or anything like that. So the idea is does periodization matter for hypertrophy? And there's been some meta-analysis and some studies done where they've done linear periodization versus undulating periodization. And they found out that they both, as long as volume is equated, they both elicited the same hypertrophic response, which is seems to be the end all for all volume debates. It's if it's equated, it's going to have the same hypertrophy. But so does it really matter in terms of being able to think about it where I just started my off season, my training should look like X, Y, and Z. And then 3 months later, my training should now be blocked off to look like this. And then as I get ready for a contest, my training should be blocked off to look like this. Is that really something that's important for the bodybuilder or for anyone looking to put on as much muscle as possible?
So I'm gonna take a step back, because it's fascinating the way the human mind, we get very, very focused on specific topics and we start missing the forest from the trees.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'm seeing this in a major way. I want to say first, we had a nice conversation before we said we got to get going because I got things to do. That would have been great information. Actually, next time we'll record that.
Yes, sir.
For people that are in the circumstances that we were talking about, because that would be helpful. So it's funny, in the intro to that question, which was nice. I like that. You talked about Olympians, best in the world. These are people who are literally, let's say someone's, an Olympian in 1 year and 4 years later, they're Olympian again. What kind of improvement percentages are they experiencing?
Right.
Let's say it's a 100-meter sprint, or name the event. It's on the order of a 1%, something like that. I don't know. I'm just guessing,
right.
At least in a track and field type of scenario. So that's where the people or those athletes are trying to eke out everything they possibly can. And NFL, annual sports where they've got periodized off season, pre-contest, in season, those sorts of things. We're also talking about elite athletes with very much a performance-based focus too. So you mentioned some of the meta-analyses, and those do tend to show that as far as strength in terms of 1 rep max is better improved with a periodized type of approach, or an undulating periodization type of approach. Periodization in general too. The thing that's interesting about that is that linear periodization model, this is the kind of the biggest criticism, ends up being the basis of periodization in a large part is variation to some degree. Is that you're basically coming at the stimulus for evoking strength, or where we're thinking about it now, muscle hypertrophy, from various angles. And it's something about that variety, which is one of the basic training principles: progressive overload, variety, specificity. Those are kind of the basic things that we can toss into that's like training principles 101.
Right.
Is that if you do a training block where you like a linear hypertrophy, strength, power type of thing, where your volume is high, your loads are low, and then you sort of incrementally reduce the volume, increase the loads until you get to where you're going to do a 1 rep max or max efforts. And your outcome measure is strength in terms of 1 rep max, and you spent the last month just doing 1 rep maxes. Is that because of the variety in training that you had in the previous 3 months or 4 months or however long your study might have been? Or is that because you've got a specificity of training thing going on here?
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing because it's nice. In my mind, in a very big way, the people who can get the strongest, as long as they're eating to support that muscular growth that comes along with the strength, are the ones who are going to get the biggest. If you have, well, let's say you've got, this wonderful program this study that lasts 2 years, and in your outcome measure, you have one group that increases strength by 50% on average on all the major lifts, and they're eating to make muscular gains as bodybuilders would. You've got that all under control. You've got inordinate amounts of money. The NIH decided, we don't care about people who are sick, people who are obese with diabetes and metabolic syndrome. We just care about building monstrous bodybuilders.
Yeah.
So they start giving us millions of dollars to do this. And so one group gets a 50% increase in strength. The other group gets a 100% increase in strength. I'm going to bet that the group that had double the strength gains, 100% versus 50%, is going to also have a larger increase in muscle mass over those 2 years of training. So there's some important things to say, like the performance, the form will follow function.
Right.
Is the idea, at least in my mind. And there are some studies showing that strength increases are associated with muscle growth or lean body mass or fat-free mass body composition change. There's an association there that does it, but not a ton of them.
Right.
And as an aside, I just mentioned another podcast I've probably heard it mentioned on mine. Those are looking at strength, 1 rep max. I would love to see, since we now are we have a really well-founded body of literature showing that high rep sets, and blood flow restriction too. So low load training can produce whole muscle growth to the same relative extent as high load training. So 80%, 1 rep max, 3 sets or 5 sets or what have you, versus 30% or 40%. As long as you're going to failure and your maximal efforts basically on those sets, you get just as much growth with the low load. So if we know that the strength gains, which are going to be greater, and this has been demonstrated in those studies too where they measured it, in the high load situation, that's specificity of training, it's not a surprise. And if we know from some of the other work that the progression in strength, those who get the strongest tend to grow the most, generally speaking. Again, I'd love to see that documented more in the studies that have been done. What about the folks who are starting off with, measly 40-pound loads on, weights on exercise they might use 100 pounds on normally, doing 20 or 30 reps per set?
Yeah.
What about the progression there? Do we see that those who are progressed the most performance-wise there also get the most muscle mass? And the reason I kind of bring that up now, or the connection, would be if we're thinking, for instance, in a periodized type of regime where we're looking at performance, where you're doing a higher volume and then you're dropping your volume down and increasing your load, just a basic linear periodization type of regime, or an undulating periodization type of regime. If we can see that across the gamut of the loads that increase muscle mass, the low load training, blood flow restriction, and the heavier training, 80, 70, 90% of 1 rep max, if basically it's a somewhat of a certainty, or we can at least expect with some statistical significance that the progression in all of those scenarios, low load, high load, and everything in between, is going to be reflected in muscle growth. And we can get better gains in performance by doing a periodized approach. That tells us that periodizing our training to improve performance in the gym is going to help with growing muscle.
Right.
Because there's an association between form and function. Better performance means better gains in terms of muscle mass. And that just makes total sense. And the thing that's just sort of so unusual, and I even went back and looked at some old data that I had from when I was in grad school, and I couldn't make it. Was a very different type of model. I wanted to see if I could figure that out. We didn't get an association, but it was like the progression of time under tension during an electrical stimulation loading procedure that we did with a Kincom dynamometer. But we have all these papers that have been done with the low load training, and it's in the method sections, or they refer to it. You presume, at least, if they don't mention it explicitly. I'm almost certain there's some progression. They don't start off with 30 pounds and just stick with 30 pounds.
Right. They usually progress in some manner if the reps go over their desired rep range, and they've been
exactly.
Yeah.
They're like the basic kind of DeLorme style, like 3 sets of 10. Like once you can, you start with sets of 8. Once you get sets of 12, you go up to any, so you get this. Like it's basic progressive overload. So if you have individuals who are increasing the load like every time they come in, versus those who maybe only bump the load up like 3 times over the course of the whole study, which is 20 training sessions or something. I'm guessing the ones that are bumping up the load, who are like getting after it and are tearing up the quote unquote logbook, the lab book, are going to get the most muscle mass. So there's a connection there, and it's funny because I think there's actually data that's sitting on computers in statistical analysis program app. And Excel spreadsheets and all sorts of places that could give us a little more insight. And I'm hoping that, I keep on mentioning this and hoping someone will say, oh, I'm going to go back and look at data retroactively.
Yeah.
So, lots of thoughts there. But the idea of periodization. So, let me bring back to one of the big picture things. So we've got the idea of periodization for high level athletes. But if we look at those studies, and this was seeing the forest from the trees, the studies that are being done, and you'll even see this as a limitation in those meta-analyses, in large part are done with untrained individuals.
Yeah.
So you're going to get growth no matter what. It's a wonderful thing statistically, as you know, because you love stats from what we were talking about before. You love your stats class. Is that if you have a large magnitude effect, then you're going to be most likely at least to see that your training produced an effect.
Right.
It's nice to have an effect, from the intervention, and then if you have some sort of an experimental condition that you're looking to see if it impacts that experimental intervention, then at least you want some kind of an effect first and foremost. So untrained people are great for that, and plus trained folks, you're not going to be able to train them long enough to get much of a movement, or you have to have so many of them in order to pick up on a statistically significant effect. Or they're just not willing to let someone else take the reins.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if it were you, or maybe me, I would love to be in a situation. Who knows? Maybe this could happen. But if let's say like the world were like totally enamored with fortitude training, everyone just wants to do it. People are just chomping at the bit to do fortitude training and do it like through me, and I could advertise. Then Tampa's pretty big.
Yeah.
I guess I'm in LA or some big city and say, you can come enter this study and be trained by Scott Stevenson personally for 1 year doing fortitude training. And we compare the fortitude training principles versus a linear periodization model. And that would be a way to get some of those advanced people in.
Yeah.
Maybe. But that doesn't happen. Like that's
right.
Yeah.
And I was talking to Ben about that, because Ben, he was saying, anyone that goes to his gym, he can give them the program and make sure they pull it off if we wanted to ever do something like that with his people. I was like, kind of this similar to what you're saying, where it's like, well, if Ben puts that out there, then everyone's going to listen to it, and he can have control over how they're training. So it'll give you more of an advanced look at that population.
Yeah. And the thing too, but with a system like Ben's, or with fortitude training, like there's an issue with the science to some degree, in that science needs to be able to isolate one particular variable. So everything, as we talked about before, keep the volume the same, control for that, which could be a very tricky thing. Sometimes it makes for very odd training plans, but you control for that, and then you just add in a daily undulating periodization schema.
Right.
Or even those linear periodization versus undulating periodization plans, where you see that maybe you get greater strength gains in a linear periodization, where you end up during the last month just doing triples and doubles and singles.
Yeah.
Is it specificity or not? Well, it's hard. And you kept the volume the same in the other ones. So what do you have to isolate one way or another, right. And the scientific, it's very difficult to come up with an experimental design. It's interesting. They've done studies where they've just had people go and just come in and do 1 rep maxes, and you can get just basically the same strength gains as you do when you training.
Yeah.
If you're not doing 1 rep maxes.
Right. Yeah. I've seen a couple studies where they compared a training program where 1 rep maxes was like the bulk of their program as compared to a regular periodization program. And obviously the specificity of the 1 rep max gave them greater gains in the 1 rep max.
Yeah, the regular training, towards 1 rep max, yeah. You can actually get muscle growth just from doing isometric training, just flexing.
Yeah,
nothing. Like there's a study that's demonstrated that. So if you think of those things, that we're looking at 1 rep max as a performance measure, as opposed to like what's actually going on during the training days, what's your training log showing you as a subject in the lab. And so the outcome measure for performance isn't representative of what's being adapted to necessarily.
Yeah.
Because if you're training with, 8, 10, 15, 20 reps and you're testing with a 1 rep max, you're not testing what is being trained.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So that shows that. And then if you look at the notion that you can just do muscular contractions with no load, no shortening, and produce muscle growth. And they've shown this with isometric training for a while, but you can produce substantial growth that way. Or are we just fapping in the wind with all these other manipulations of the training regime because we've got subjects that can grow so easily that just posing will make them grow as well as any other manipulations of the training that you've done. So the issue then, looking back at periodization and trying to take the notion from high level athletes who are trying to get that last 0.1% that takes them from 4th place, out of the medals to getting a gold,
right,
and going down in history with their country, is that they're different than the people who are being largely studied.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And I'm saying this because it seems like an obvious thing, now that I've kind of expounded upon it. But if people can go back and listen, like the way you asked the question, there's nothing invalid about the way you asked the question, but it's as if we're trying to take information from. It's a violation of external validity, actually, in a statistical way. So we're trying to take information from studying untrained people, and that's not really externally valid to the people who are going to make the best use possibly of those finer manipulations of their program variables to produce muscle growth. So it's not relevant. There's another simple way of saying to some degree, not that we can't, not at least in the way that people like to take it. We can definitely get pointers. Without a doubt, the research is not invalid.
Right.
It's just the external validity is limited when you try to pair it over to high level bodybuilders, for instance.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because if you look at, if you don't look at periodization models within the research, because a lot of that is done within the realm of sports, and you just look at some of the hypertrophy studies where it shows that people can have a hypertrophic response with 5 reps in reserve all the way up to 0 reps in reserve. So then would you periodize a program based off of those studies where you start off with like a 5 reps in reserve week 1, and then you slowly build your mesocycle to 0 reps in reserve? Because I've seen people do that, like Dr. Mike Israetel does that, where he starts with reps in reserve and then he works his way all the way to failure, and then he deloads and then he repeats that. But then I've also seen a lot of bodybuilders, anecdotally, where they just train to failure every single day they're in the gym, and they just do something like they have rotations of exercises that they continue to do, or they try to eke out, 2.5 kilos or something like that. So, in terms of maybe not necessarily what the science says, or we can do that as well, but anecdotally, like, is there a way to where you should think in periodization so that you can continue to progress, or should you always get the most from week 1 and then you just ride out all the way till you can't?
It's going to depend on the person.
Yeah.
Almost. And we can start with the science, actually. Yeah. And this, I just talked about this on a couple of podcasts, but the study that used Mike's, and Mike has a very legitimate approach because it works for people, obviously.
Right.
People are buying his programs, and when you can grow from 5 reps in reserve, then you're going to grow from 4 and 3 and 2 and 1, and so you can definitely progressively overload in that manner. So there was a study involving whey protein supplementation that used his plan. He's one of the authors on that, and then from that study. Where they looked at the subjects, Cody Hahn was the first author on the study that published this, and this is the one that expounded upon the idea of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy.
Yeah,
and you may know this because you may have heard me talk about it before. When they looked at those subjects in the original study, they only took the upper 50 percentile. They took those who grew. On average, there wasn't in the subjects that they considered to evaluate the possibility of sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, they didn't, on average, have experienced any muscle growth.
Yeah.
In fact, there was. I remember talking about this on my podcast with Scott McNally, and they showed the individual bars for the individual subjects, and there was one poor sod who he really regressed. He really went back. He must have been very upset. He must have been pissed.
Right.
Because he just way overdid it. Talk about overtraining in terms of muscle size.
Mm-hmm. And
then there was someone on the other end who was just growing like a weed.
Right.
And you can look at, there's Damas has done a study too, where they did a retroactive evaluation of a frequency study. It's 3 sets per workout, 2, 3, or 5 times a week for the knee extensions. And I've talked about this one many times. And the cool thing about this, and I love this model, this is what I use for my dissertation. It's the Scandinavians used to do this all the time, looking at glycogen, use a one-legged cycling model and you train one leg one way, train the other leg the other way. Use an internal control. It's great. It's better than even a twin because it's the same person,
right.
So they had these individuals train one leg with either 2 or 3 times a week and the other leg with 5 times a week. So they had a low and a high volume scenario with internal controls in that way. And they, on average, there was no impact on average, the means, because there was so much variation of frequency on the muscle growth. But when they looked at the individual data points, you saw that some of them grew really, really well, regardless. Some of them didn't grow all that well. They were kind of what you call a non-responder, at least in terms of muscle growth. They may have gotten some strength. I didn't see that part. They didn't publish it. I don't think I don't recall seeing it, at least. And then there were some who did better from low frequency. Now there was a volume component there too, because they had just a 3-set block for each workout. So it was 6, 9, or 15 sets per week.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like they equated the volume and they just isolated purely the training aspect of frequency. But the main point there is that some people grow well, some people don't grow well. So some people grow well from higher volume, higher frequency, spreading it out. Some people grow from the opposite way of approaching it. And then some people might experience sarcoplasmic hypertrophy if you trained the way they did in that study that was with Mike's training approach. Mm-hmm. And then some people might backslide like a mofo.
Yeah.
They not only do they not get any sarcoplasmic, they don't get any hypertrophy at all.
Yeah, I remember Jordan Peters did a podcast with Mike, and he got super intrigued by the notion of reps in reserve, and he tried it, and he said he got exponentially weaker 8 weeks into it.
Yeah, he didn't he wasn't. Yeah, it was pretty clear to, and he's obviously he's highly tuned into what's happening with his muscle size, strength, and everything else. Yeah. And I mentioned Jordan came up to him. I'm glad you knew that because not everyone has paid attention. You're probably a member on his site, so you got to see him talk about. Yeah, good man. So that made sense to him because he's as big. You don't get any bigger, pound for pound, and him, pound per inch than Jordan. 5'6", 250 plus stage weight in really good nick, as they would say, really good condition. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, there's only a few people that ever walk the planet that are that big. So it makes sense for him to try. What else can he do? in order to get a little bit more muscle mass. So the approach makes sense. It just wasn't, and I have my understanding as to why it didn't. I think Jordan does too, but he gave it a go, and that was, I think, it wasn't like all of a sudden he shrunk down to 180 and had to start over again. It wasn't the end of the world, but now he knows it doesn't work for him. So the thing, if we take a step back here and look at the periodization model, and the idea of varying frequency and volume in various ways. If you look at, let's say it's a linear type of periodization type of scenario, you might have some individuals who do better with higher volume, and they grow really well because that's what they grow from.
Yeah.
Out of the Damas study. And that is great for them. And maybe they don't do so well when they start going down to the lower reps, higher loads. And that could be for various reasons. Maybe they just don't like to train that way.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
That's the whole thing. Like, we were talking before about, the exercise physiologist and special. I mean, I'm a muscle physiologist, but I'm an armchair psychologist.
Yeah.
Because I know that this is the driving force. And I refer to a guy named Tim Noakes, who talks about this. He's a South African exercise physiologist. He used to do like renal physiology, endurance exercise. And now he's sort of gone into the notion. He's got a really nice review article where he talks about literally all the various pieces of evidence suggesting that the brain is the limiter of performance.
Yeah.
And, our expectancies, the notions of hypnosis, competitive drive, there's all sorts of, psychological aspects that can limit this. And that's all very, very cool data. People could look at his review articles and some of the things he's written. But if you just take someone who just doesn't want to train, even though they may have the physiology in a way that would respond better from an undulating periodization plan, let's say, or a strength training, a heavier load type of regime, if they don't fancy that, they don't want to do that, it's not going to work for them.
Right.
Jordan loves to train that way.
Yeah.
And it works for him. He's just a focused animal to the nth degree. And so because it probably works for him, he probably matches with his physiology. I think he would have figured out long ago that higher reps were better for him if that was the case. And then he would have been doing like 100 rep squat sets and all sorts of stuff. Like he would have but that's not the case. So part of the reason why it works so well for him is because he puts in so much effort and is so focused on doing what he knows works that he is reifying the notion that works, and he makes it work better because he believes and knows it's going to work.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So, and I don't think he disbelieved what Mike was saying. He gave it a go.
Yeah.
But, when he started to see his strength gains and what have you. So back to whether, your kind of question about whether you should start off in a periodized way. I think what I often tell people, and this is kind of gets to your question, is pick the way you like to train and train that way. And we know that you can grow from higher reps. You can grow from lower reps. You may not find that you grow as well from higher reps versus lower reps. You may not grow from higher volume versus lower volume. You may figure this out. And chances are there may even be a mismatch. I personally have a mismatch. I like to train harder and with more volume than I can recover from.
Yeah.
I'm sore all the time.
Sure.
But it's like, it's okay. Like I really like, for me, it's a little, I think it's worth it to some degree,
Right.
I know that mismatch is there. I'm remedying it a little bit, but it's taking me 40 years to try to figure that out.
Right.
So but you can periodize if you find different regimes. So the ones that I know probably the most about, obviously, are fortitude training, my training system, which has a built-in ways of periodizing in a very simplistic fashion in the program, and it's very much auto-regulatory. That's I think the most important aspect of periodization, to be honest.
Yeah.
And one of the things that may differentiate why undulating periodization may work better than a linear model for many people, at least. But if you like fortitude training, John Meadows' plans are phenomenal. I co-authored John's book on the brutality of mountain dog training, so I know a little bit about the underlying theory. People love that shit. And he's got all those different plans. Like, that's why people buy them, because the variety's there.
Right.
It keeps them motivated. It may be like if John has a plan, like I know he's added in like little bits and pieces, bells and whistles to each of his programs, different approaches. They're beautifully done. They're wonderful. And they're fun too. And they're brutal.
Yeah.
And so it may be that, someone, if you could take them and blindly run them through various training regimes and equate their psychological effort, that a certain way of training would be best for them. But that may pale in comparison to the results that they can get because they like what they're doing. They're motivated to go in the gym.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's why I think people like fortitude training, because there's enough variety in there. There's a very strong progressive overload. The logbook's looking at you. It's going to kick your ass. What are you going to do about that type of aspect to it with the loading sets? And then there's also, okay, today I'm going to find something new and different to torch the muscle, maybe an exercise I've never done before. I'm not beholden to, it's like the free fun, like I'm on vacation, I'm going to go be a meathead bodybuilder and train with every machine in the gym because I've never used these machines before.
Right.
You don't do that, but it's that idea of like, this is a fun day and I get to train really hard. And if I want to go and beat a previous best, I can. If I don't have to. And that cycling through those different aspects of the training keeps people's motivation high. And that's effort level. That's the thing about resistance exercise, first and foremost, that makes it a great stimulus for muscle growth, is that the effort level is so far beyond what we do during the course of our day-to-day lives that it evokes that adaptive stimulus for increasing muscle size for most people.
Yeah.
For as long as you're eating, I think everyone will get it. That's the thing I wonder about non-responders. What can we do about them? So,
right.
Yeah, I have a question, Brian. I can see it.
Well, I was just going to say also too, the idea of the belief in who's putting out the concept matters a lot too, right? Like if someone really looks up to you and it's your training, that's going to motivate them more. That's going to build that buy-in a lot more too. That's why everyone that believes in Jordan Peterson's way of doing things, it's like, that's the way they train because that's what Jordan told them to do. So that's what's allotted them that motivation to continue to go to the gym because they believe that that's going to give them the best response because the person they look up to the most told them it would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can't quite grasp that, because I'm totally with you. And I don't intend to offend anyone. I'm just thinking of this from a psychological perspective. Imagine sort of like any type of really like primitive religion that doesn't really make sense to you.
Yeah.
Like let's say the flying spaghetti monster. Let's say you pray to the flying spaghetti monster. Like that's that shouldn't offend anybody because that's sort of a facetious thing. But if someone really believes the flying spaghetti monster is the God that has control over all the things that are, the impact that can have on people's lives to know like, oh my gosh, tomato sauce, the flying spaghetti monster has blessed me. Today will be a glorious day. And it's going to be awesome.
Yeah.
And they believe that, and that will impact everything that they do. And everything's great. Everything's hunky dory. So if you have a belief that if you push yourself in the way that Jordan suggests, or that I've got outlined in my program, or the other program is dog crap training. So mountain dog training, and I'll toss in Jordan's plans too, as well, because they're all in the same regime. So there's 4 that you can rotate through. If you believe all those, and they'll work, you have an expectancy.
Yeah.
And that's the underlying aspect of hypnosis and what can create placebo effects.
Yeah. Interesting. You brought up the researcher in Africa, you said?
Tim Noakes, South Africa.
Yeah, Andrew Huberman, who's out at Stanford, he's done some of those same kind of tests with David Goggins and Navy SEALs, and they found that those guys are really good at getting to whatever part of the brain that tells them to quit doing things, and they've kind of rewired it so that they continue to push through, and they found the same thing. Like the brain's going to tell you to limit yourself more than you're physically capable of, which is always fascinating to me because I've been through a lot of that type of training, and it's very much true. Some of the best athletes in the world that you would never expect to quit because you would just think they would blow through everything. They're usually one of the first people to quit because psychologically they're just mentally not there.
Yeah, look, the Navy SEALs training is, you hear people go on to talk about, like, you've got guys who on paper, like, so the guy was, he was a swimmer on his collegiate team, and he, qualified for the Olympics, and, he's got all the physical attributes. He maxed out all the tests, right. But no, he doesn't make it through because he doesn't want it.
Yeah, exactly.
And you got another guy who's like stumpy. It looks like he's going to like just sink like a rock.
Right.
And that guy is just the badass. He's the guy you want, the trenches with you all the time.
Fighting tooth and nails just to survive.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. It's always fascinating stuff, that type of thing, and how you can bring that into the weight room. Because I feel like you see so many people, and they've done research on this, where people don't really know where their true failure point is. They tell them, we're going to go 10 reps to failure. And then people pick the weight, and they end up doing 10 reps extra. Stuff. Yeah. So it's always interesting, that type of psychological aspect that can really change the way you look at training too.
Yeah. There's an article I wrote, you probably wrote for Elite FDS, where I just talk about a particular study, the Ikai and Steinhaus study. It's the psychological determinants modifying the expression of human strength, I think is the title of it. And they hypnotize people, they give them amphetamines, they get them drunk, they shoot off a starter gun, they yell at them while they're doing a elbow flexion, 1 rep max test, or a max voluntary test. Yeah, I thought maybe you'd seen the article. It's awesome. It's amazing.
Yeah, I'll have to check it out. I mean, I might have, but it might have been a while too.
I mean, like, you can't like say, so we're going to see how much, a fifth of beam makes people stronger, or if we give them amphetamines. But this is in the 60s, so they did this, Yeah. This is before, the social stigmas were there, and obviously we don't need to do that. There's no reason. We're not going to give those to anyone, not soldiers or whatever. So we're not. Maybe the military might do something like that, but this was published, and they found that those pharmacological and psychological, they hypnotize someone. It's in the method section. This is from the Journal of Applied Physiology. It's, well-renowned, high-impact factor journal. In the method section, document that the hypnosis was real. They took, it was a high-level strength athlete who didn't believe in hypnosis. He was deemed least amenable to hypnosis by the hypnotist. And under hypnosis, told him that he's going to touch the back of his hand with a hot poker, and which time he touched his hand with the back of a pen. Yeah. It wasn't a hot poker, and he blistered.
Yeah. I remember hearing about that. Yeah.
Yeah. I've talked about before. And the thing that's just, it bears repeating. I mean, it's probably some people I know listen to a lot of my podcasts are like, oh God, here it goes again. But how did that happen? There was no trauma to evoke that response. Yeah. It's like, it would be the same as if, like, you imagine someone cutting you with a knife and then there's a cut.
Right. Yeah.
How did it happen? Like, where did the inflammatory response come from? There was nothing to trigger it. There's no cell lysing. There was no damage. There's no necrosis. It just happened because of the mind. Yeah. So if those sorts of things, I mean, who knows? Maybe that was just bullshit. Kai and Steinhaus were, bamboozling everybody. But there's some pretty amazing things that can happen. Mm-hmm. And I think that if you take someone, for instance, they don't have to be hypnotized. They don't have to have, that firm of a belief or expectation or expectancy that they're going to do really well. And then they think to themselves, you know what? Here's my plan. I'm going to periodize. I'm going to combine an undulating periodization and a linear periodization model, because I know from what's worked for me in the past that if I start off, I can handle higher volumes. I'm going to leave, 3 or 4 reps in reserve. And then eventually, as the loads get heavier and my reps go down, I have to bring my volume down, because I've experienced this. I know this. To use the signs that I get, I have a hard time sleeping. My appetite goes away, blah, blah, blah. And they've learned what happens with them. Then that feeds back and provides them with assurance and expectancy that they're going to be successful with what they're trying to do. And they're actually learning what works best and making it work best at the same time, because they believe it's going to work best. Right. Because they're sure of themselves. That's how coaches can help, actually. Right. Yeah. So it's up to the person. Dog crap training, DC training. It's got. I mean, and fortitude training is based off that kind of premise. You just blast and cruise. Yeah. There's no meso microcycling. You just come in and you do this. The first workout after your cruise is the same as your last work before your next cruise.
Yeah.
You can change from a 2-way to a 3-way split and add widowmakers. So there's some variation in volume that you can bring in, but you just go for it.
Yeah.
And that works phenomenally. But the people who are willing to do DC training are people that are of the mindset that works for DC training.
Right. Yeah. I think that's such a huge part in developing your training program. Because even John Kiley, who's done a lot of research on periodization and stress management, and he's found through some of his work that periodization isn't necessarily the best model for sports either. It's the whole idea of managing stress, fatigue, and recovery. That should be auto-regulated.
Yes.
Without an actual predisposed plan, right? Like you should be able to auto-regulate your training based off of those 3 factors of stress management, recovery, and fatigability, and then auto-regulate based off of that. So the idea where periodization shouldn't even be something that you think about. It should just be regulatory based off of those things.
It's the forest from the trees idea.
Yeah.
You can have like a 15 or a 12 or a 20 week program planned out where you're going to slowly add volume and your rep reserve will change and all those sorts of things. But then, your dog gets sick and you end up in the ER for a whole night. And then so you go and you have a crappy leg workout, and you don't eat because your dog's still sick and you're just totally thrown off. All of that, the micromanaging, which would be applicable if you were an Eastern Bloc athlete who just lived on a compound,
right?
And they gave you hot cold contrast baths and massages every day, and you're training 3 times a day, and all your food's provided for you, and they force you to have or you're in the Middle East training at Oxygen Gym, which is a compound basically.
Right.
You have nothing else. Then that icing matters.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're talking about, so should we do chocolate? I think we're going to switch from strawberry to chocolate icing. It's like on the dog shit, because the rest of my life in my recovery is dog shit because my dog got sick, and I missed 3 meals this week and I'm not dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's otherwise. So, but here's the thing. I think if someone has a plan of attack that involves a very well constructed and outline and detailed approach, that can keep them on track in a way such that those are important variables, because then they've got a plan. And some people do, some people are like, road trips are a great example. So where are we going? I don't know. Let's just fucking drive. Let's just go, I don't know. I don't want to drive into the sun. Let's go the other way. It's like, okay, let's go that way. Let's go east. And we're heading to Miami. Maybe, I don't know, maybe we'll stop somewhere else. No, I need to know, hold on, let me Google something. So we could go down to, no, let's just drive and stop when we want to. Some people they need the plan. They have to have, and others can be like, let's drive until, we get tired. And you can mix that up. And I think that, I know I had the worst. We took kind of one family vacation when I was a kid. My dad was a doctor, so he was very busy, always on call. We didn't do a lot of, we had really kind of 2 vacations. One I barely remember, I was so young. And the other one, we got in an RV. We planned out all this shit we're going to do every day. And it was just horrible. There was no auto-regulating of the fun. And that would be what someone might do if they have this plan that they stick to. They might actually end up sort of serving that obsessive compulsive nature of their behavior, which may be why they're doing this in the first place. So they have to have control over their body. We're back to the psychology thing again. And in the meantime, they literally they drive themselves through a meso or a macro cycle following this regime, and they don't get any growth. Kind of like going on a vacation that isn't a vacation because nope, tomorrow we got to do this. Tomorrow we got to do that. Next day we have to do that. That's not fun. That's not the purpose of vacation, is to enjoy yourself, relax, recover. So it's going to depend on the person. And some people, there's another way of looking at this. I'm sort of thinking of all the various types of individuals you might see just generically. You can't cover them all because everyone's obviously different. But there might also be someone who likes to have that plan and they will stick to it, but they also are aware that in order to stick to the plan, they have to auto-regulate too. Yeah. So they don't blindly just stick to the plan. They're thinking, you know what? here's what my dog got sick. What I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to make an adjustment, and this is an adjustment that's possible on the plan. Or, my girlfriend's going to come help me with the dog, because I want to make sure that happens. And so they can see where sticking with the plan could be a recipe for disaster, and they make accommodations otherwise. And that's a very kind of smart way to auto-regulate. That's a proactive auto-regulation in a sense. And that's a great, that's just basically, watching out for impending doom and impending disasters. And then there's also retroactive, which is really kind of what auto-regulation is it's like, okay, so yeah, I'm tired. I'm talked about this. I have a perceived recovery status scale. It's like a 0 to 10 Likert scale that I've been using it with clients now for a while. It's on my website. You can find it there in the Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach resources. And it's a way to just say, look, what's your overall general state of recovery? Yeah. It sort of reflects the nervous system to some degree.
Right. Yeah.
But then there's also like how recovered is an individual muscle.
Yeah.
So like today I just trained legs a little while ago. I felt pretty good. Like I had a pretty, PRS was pretty good, and I wasn't even expecting it. I went in, I started I'm like, oh shit, I'm pretty sore.
Yeah.
So I adjusted.
Right.
So I paid attention to both those things. So that was a true auto-regulation. So there's all sorts of in-betweens and shades of gray
right
along the spectrum as to whether someone should or shouldn't do, some type of periodization. Some people would and Jordan, this would probably fit him. If someone said, okay, so we're doing a 12-week block, and for the next 6 weeks, I want you to leave 3 reps in the tank on all your sets. I'd be like, I don't want to masturbate. Can I just really have sex with the weights? I really want to live.
Right.
Once a week, can I go? Don't make me do that. It's I'm almost there. I want to get after it.
Yeah.
That would drive me crazy. I would not be able to do that. And also, I don't think for me and for many people who've been at it for a while that eventually, in order for a set to create a stimulus, and this is an important aspect in terms of using volume progression, I think, at least if you're incorporated high reps and reserve sets, is that you don't get a stimulus if you leave 5 reps in the tank. Imagine yourself training.
Right.
Maybe if you haven't trained for a few months and you come back, that's where that absolutely makes sense. You sort of resensitize yourself. You just come back, just get in the gym and get some blood flowing. You're going to get plenty of stimulus because you haven't done anything for a few months. But if you've been at it and you're progressively moving up loads and your muscle mass is increasing, and you're probably not in any given set with 4 or 5 reps in reserve for an advanced, very muscular person who's been dotting the I's and crossing the T's, those sets aren't going to do anything for them. And I think that's what Jordan figured out. So eventually you're going to you run into the conundrum of the sets have to be so taxing in order to provide a stimulus that they also have the adverse effect that they impair your recovery. Right. And they quote unquote fatigue you, in the way people use that word nowadays, to such an extent that your volume is going to be limited. So I think, and this is what I'll just call up one more notion that was kind of cool. We had our reigning Mr. Olympia, Mr. Curry, on, mm-hmm. and he was talking about at Oxygen Gym when guys come in there. He sees guys like advanced bodybuilders come in, and they just kind of run them through the ringer, and almost like their way of selecting them is whether they can hang with the high volume that they do in there.
Right.
And that's what he's seeing is those guys, they train really hard and they can handle that high volume. And most high level bodybuilders train that way. And my thought on that is that, all those guys aren't doing death sets like Jordan does, but Jordan admits that he doesn't have the genetics that like James Hollingshead does or Luke Sando did or folks like that. But if you'll run into your personal sort of conundrum between finding sets that are effortful enough to produce growth and how much you can recover from. And that's a function, of course, all of the things that your sleep, your food, pharmaceuticals, what have you. But the really best guys in the world, it seems like many of them can handle tremendous volumes and workloads Ronnie Coleman is the best example of that.
Exactly. Yeah.
He destroyed himself, but like that he could do what he did. It's just amazing.
Yeah.
So he could train that hard with that volume and evoke that much of a stimulus and recover from it. So the extent to which you can grow is a function of the extent to which you can create high level stimuli set by set throughout the workout and still recover from that. And if your recovery sucks and you're advanced, you gonna have to train hard to make any movement forward, and you can only train with as many sets as you can recover from. And eventually you'll come to some point where I can't train with any more sets and I can't recover from any more sets, and I have to keep training this hard in order to get any growth. So that's where I peter. That's my plateau.
Yeah.
So that's the way I sort of conceptualize.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So that would bring up this other notion that Cody Hahn has talked about, where there's this desensitization period where you can train at lesser volume, lesser load, and it's going to allow your body to push further and beyond because you're quote unquote desensitizing to the hard training. And to me, that is like the idea of, you're trying to replenish your androgen receptors by cruising, and then you go back on, and apparently they're supposed to be more engulfed to where you're able to collect more androgens because there's some desensitization to androgens. That's the way I look at it, at least, when we kind of know, like, or at least the literature kind of shows, like, there's really no desensitization to androgens, if I'm correct on that, right? Like, you can exponentially take as much as you want and it'll continue to give you better effects. You just have to deal with more side effects as well.
Well, the thing that many people do is they look at the androgen receptor density and equate that to responsiveness.
Yeah.
And you see an upregulation in androgen receptors. But obviously if the phenomenon were true, we'll just take side effects out, that you got an increased responsiveness to androgens with higher and higher doses, then we would see, there would be the diminishing returns would not apply there. And that's what we do actually see.
Yeah.
So some of that is side effects related and toxicity related. So the androgen receptor density probably is not what explains what is pretty well known is that, yes, you're going to have, a dose response curve that eventually has a maximal effectiveness dose. And some of the reason for that max effectiveness is because there's side effects that are countering whatever anabolism might be going on. But androgen receptors are not probably explaining that because they tend to go up when you go on. Yeah. And that's kind of an unknown thing.
Yeah. So, but then isn't the desensitization kind of like the same thing? Like, you're allowing your muscles to relax and recover from the onslaught you just put on them. And then they're going to super compensate beyond what they've done before because you've had this desensitization period. Isn't that the idea pretty much behind what he was saying, or am I misconstruing that? I don't know what he said. So I'm not sure exactly what, I don't know if I've heard the podcast or him say that, but from what you're saying, it sounds like he's reiterating what the idea of a taper would be as part of a periodization plan. Right. Yeah.
And I have this built into the fortitude training, is that you will lose your fatigue to a couple different concepts. If you deload to some degree, the fitness or the muscle mass that you attained will not be lost. So we've got some muscle memory that's there. Whereas your sensitivity to load will go up. And ideally, of course, your fatigue and your recovery is also improved. Your fatigue has gone down. So now you're recovered. And so like if you tried to train with 10 steps and you're unrecovered at that point in time because you've been just blasting it, you're not going to get anything. So you have to be recovered.
Yeah.
In order for any stimulus to provide, any training session to provide an actual stimulus. And so, that's the idea, is that you would sort of stair step your way through by keeping the muscle during a deload. And I was going to say refreshing, talking about like the receptor idea, but restoring your sensitivity to the stimulus.
This is beyond a deload, though. This is like a month to 2-month type of resensitization.
Yeah.
I think one of the research models was on rats that they looked at, but another one was on women, and they trained for X amount of months, and then they took like 3 months off, or they took 3 months of desensitization where they cut everything. I think they cut all their volume into just a quarter of it, and they trained that way. And then they got back on another training program. And the idea was that they could train with such low volumes and just refresh their body so that they can push again. But it was in such a long capacity that I just think that there'd be so much detraining, defitness related that you're not going to get that super compensation effect. That would just be my opinion on it.
For what? I thought you were talking about some of Bob Stearns' work from 1990 with women, where they detrained them.
That might be what they were referring to. I can't. I'm not. I can't
until you said they dropped. Yeah, you may. I do this too. I kind of combine studies in my head, but yeah, they had a prolonged training study with women, but they then detrained them and then took a subset of those women and then retrained them, and they didn't lose. They lost a little bit in the type 2Bs, as they called them at the time.
Yeah, well, I think but they put like 3 or 4 studies together to talk about a resensitization. It wasn't actually something that he did on his own. And I think that what you're saying is the exact one he was talking about.
That's the idea. I have an Instagram post where I pull that specific study up, because Bob Stearns was he was a close friend of my mentor, Gary Dudley. Bob, I told this, or at least Dr. Dudley told me that Bob lived with a horse in his house. He was a great guy. He's pretty eccentric kind of dude.
Yeah,
pretty cool guy. But so that was a detraining study. They didn't lose any muscle mass, or fiber size, at least in that case.
So how is that applicable, or is that even applicable to anyone that's beyond a beginner or intermediate or advanced? Like, how would you apply that to kind of a periodization approach if you were looking to do that? I don't know. I think that was just sort of a proof of concept type of notion. Not that you'd necessarily say, okay, we're going to take 2 months off or 3 months off and not train. You may not have to go that long, but the proof of concept, at least from that study, and they trained the bejesus out of these women. They had them doing like squats, leg presses, hack squats, knee extensions, and hamstring curls. I think at least twice a week, 3 sets to failure each. And they grew, the fiber sizes increased like 50% or something like that. It was the most dramatic increase in fiber size that I've seen in any study ever that I've ever read. And they kept that. And my guess is also that they may have, if they started off, they actually lost circumference on their hips in that particular study. If we're talking about the same one, but this is a great study anyway, it covers the same idea. So they turned into hard bodies, I'm absolutely sure, because they grew a lot of muscle and their measurements went down. So when they were detraining, they probably were living differently, and they may have been more active than they were beforehand. Yeah. And who knows what they may have done. The women who decided to come back and wanted to train again, they may have been a very different subset of the women who didn't want to come back and train again. Right. Yeah, exactly.
So there's a selection bias issue there. But those may have been the ones like, okay, we're not supposed to train, but shit, I'm taking the stairs everywhere because I like how I look. Yeah. And I'm going to park my car at the end of the parking lot, so I have to walk around. And they're doing they start doing other things. They're not doing weight training. They followed the letter of the study. But part of that lack of loss of muscle fiber size may have been specific to those people, because those are the ones who wanted to come back and train again. And that was brutal training. It was just lower body training in that particular study. So, but the idea, it does hold that you can, there's a muscle memory phenomenon in place. So we know that fatigue will dissipate. I don't think anyone's going to argue that. Like, you give yourself a week or two of deloading, and you will hold on to muscle mass most of the time. But I have some caveats here. So that's the idea, and there's a repeated bout effect that can persist to some degree for many months. There's some studies shown that you exercise someone, just whack them really badly, they'll get really sore, lots of muscle damage, and you run through the same bout, even a couple months later, you don't see quite the extent of the damage you did the first time. Right. They'll still get pretty sore, but there's high variability there too. And there's a number. I've got a talk I it's actually part of another talk that I give, but there's a nice review article I can send it to you if you don't want, where they've sort of outlined some of the single polymorphic, the SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms that are involved with making people more amenable to muscle damage. And it has to do with some structural proteins, IGF-2, and some of the inflammatory markers that are involved. So like basically, what's happening to the muscle in terms of its amenability to being actually physically damaged. So structural proteins, costameric proteins. The IGF-2 is probably part of the growth response. So how well does it repair itself from an autocrine perspective? And then the extent to which inflammation happens. So some people aren't going to experience that sort of refreshing, so to speak.
Yeah.
In the same way that others will. And some people probably don't experience that muscle memory as well as others. I just talked with a person the other day who can routinely go back and forth like by about 30 pounds. We're trying to figure out some things. Yeah. And I'm like, well, how long does it take you to get these 30? And this is not a big person. 30 pounds is a lot of body weight for this person. Okay, and it's largely muscle. It's not, we're not talking about like a 300-pound person. We're talking about a less than 200-pound person in like 8 months. Huh. But then they lose it really quickly too. So they don't hold size very well. Yeah. And you can see that with like people's metabolism. It's like, they gain weight really fast. They don't gain fat, but then they just can't get lean hardly at all. So their body basically holds its set point or its body fat settling point really, really staunchly, protects that. And some people can get really lean easily but they also get fat really easily too.
Yeah.
So there's all these variations. One of the things that bring you back to this idea that with DC training that I saw, and Dante had a very sort of generic way of periodizing, and this applies more directly to our topic today, where you blast, and then I'm trying to think, he had sort of it was kind of up to the person, really. He left it up to them, which is a great way to do it. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot of folks weren't tuned in well enough to be able to figure out on their own what worked best. So some people would just blast so hard that they were not functionally overreaching. It was a non-functional overreaching. Yeah. So they were literally starting to lose, not quite overtrained, but maybe getting close. So they're like, fuck, thank God. I'm like, I can't go to the gym like for another 2 weeks for sure. And that can be done. That's okay. It worked for Ronnie Coleman. Like you take months off, but then they come back, and I used to see this when I was doing DC training under Dante's. I was his trainer. He would send me clients because I was doing his system, and it would take them like 2/3 of the next blast to get the gains they had.
Right.
So they gain for 10 weeks, and then the next blast they go back, and they take them like 6-7 weeks to get back to where they once were. So they were taking 3 steps forward and 2 steps back every time.
Yeah.
And so what I did with fortitude training was I tried to like learn from that a little bit, and in a way that would help people. So my version of a cruise, I call it an intensive cruise. So it's a progressive blast, but an intensive cruise, and it's basically a taper.
Yeah.
So you don't, and it's planned out in a very generic way. But what it does is keeps people training, keeps the effort levels high, reduces the volume, lets them do just those fun types of sets. So the motivation is there, and then gives them some time off. It works very, very, very well for lots of people. Mm-hmm. And I think it takes out that idea that I can just push as hard as I want to go and then do nothing, because that's like an all or nothing type of thing. Right. Whereas like, you know what? I'm not going to be able to like eke this out. I needed to pull back now, like literally kind of I'm going to de-volume, not deload, but de-volume, not de-effort. Like you would if you're getting ready for a track meet or what have you, or like I was a swimmer in high school. We would do some like a couple, like basically we almost you do the event you're going to swim, mm-hmm. But if you're swimming 800 meters or 50 meters, you do a few of those, but your volume would be substantially reduced.
Right. Yeah.
So your fatigue would wash away, so to speak. But it's specific. So that I took that approach with the form follows function kind of notion in mind, and created a deload that seems to avoid that. It allows you to sort of wash away the fatigue and sort of resensitize to some degree, but you're also growing in a functional overreaching way.
Yeah.
and you're getting stronger too. So when people would come back, this works the way, and they figure out what works best for them. They come back, and a lot of them would be just amazed at how much stronger they got if they did things right. And that was just a matter of fine tuning.
Right.
And there's a study was done, Wernbaum's group. He did a review article. He's, Borga Fairley.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. Yeah. Great guy. He's, you can find him. He doesn't do a ton of interviews, but Wernbaum was sort of his mentor, and they did a study, and I can't remember the details of it all right now, but they basically, they ran some people through the ringer, like really like train them like twice a day. They may have done like 6 days, and maybe they put like 10 training sessions in a 6 days, so close to twice a day.
Yeah.
And they gave him a break, and then they ran them through again, and then they didn't get any growth. They gave him like 5 days of training and this isn't the exact protocol, but it's something like this.
Right.
Really, really crazy training, 5 days of nothing. And they didn't see any growth happen. So they gave him like another 5 days of that, and they tolerated it better the second go around. And then they followed muscle size for like the next 20 plus days.
Mm-hmm.
And they saw an increase in muscle size that happened, but it was only like after a week.
Wow.
It took quite a while. And that was like that's the one paper that I kind of know of that demonstrates this overreaching effect in terms of muscle size.
Yeah.
So, and that kind of shows that, I mean, I can stay sore for a week. I know this.
Yeah.
And many people can. You go and you just start to you stretch out, and you're like, that muscle is still sore. I don't notice it during the day, and I'm conditioned my mind to not I'm like, oh God, I'm so sore. You don't give a shit. You're dive bombing the kamikaze dive bombing the toilet because your legs are sore. It's been doing that for 40 years now. It's okay.
Yeah.
I haven't fallen in yet, so I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. But so there can be some sort of overreaching in that way, sort of a rebounding of muscle size that can happen. And who knows, like with the Sterin study with the women, they didn't take any biopsies during that it's like a 6 week or 2 month detraining period. Who knows?
Yeah.
They may have actually grown some muscle, and then it came back down to where it once was. We don't know what happened in between there.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it was on the way down. Like there's one of the things that happens, and this has been a criticism of a lot of the literature, is that, or it's been a criticism that's been put forth now that applies to a lot of the literature, I think, is that you do a pre and a post measurement.
Yeah.
And like Brad's studies have done this. Fortunately, there was all that literature from Brazil that was showing dose response that was bullshit.
Right. Yeah,
I'm like,
so unfortunate. Yeah.
Yeah, it really was. But when you make multiple measurements, it gives you a better idea of what's going on, and that's what someone sees in the gym.
Right.
That's like if someone tries a periodization approach and they make great gains in the first, the higher volume period, and they don't make shit for gains later. That could be because high volume works better for them, or high volume basically only works for so long, and then when it stops working, it doesn't matter what they switch to.
Yeah.
Whether it's higher or lower volume, that's just they need to pull back. But having those measurements throughout the course of a training system or training plan could tell you like whether, some of the studies don't tell us is like we got, day 0 and then end of 12 weeks.
Right.
And some people probably maybe did really well for a while, and then like they should have taken a cruise or a break or periodized things at 5 weeks in.
Yeah, because everyone's recovery is going to be completely different.
Right. And some people maybe just kept on going. Even though like the one-legged study where the higher volume did better, that could have been happening too. So that's what people in the gym can do, because if you have logbooks and you're doing a perceived recovery scale and you're looking at the recoverability of the muscle mass, you can see those things. And so one option for your periodization is just taking a break.
Mm-hmm.
One option is switching to a different type of regime that may allow for less fatigue and more recovery. So just dropping your volume down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess just understanding the concepts of what keeps the ball moving in the right direction, what elicits hypertrophy, and then how you can reduce fatigue so that you can continue to train. As long as you understand those major concepts, then you can build out whatever plan you want. It doesn't have to have a name to it. I think a lot of people fall in love with names on things, like this is the periodization model that I should follow. It's like, well, you should follow the Scott Stevenson periodization model for you individually, right? You should follow the Tony Montgomery model if you're Tony Montgomery. And as long as you understand those concepts and you understand fatigue and reducing it, then you can continue to ride those waves of up and down, as long as you're training within whatever 5 to 30 rep range, going close to failure to elicit some type of response.
Yeah. I, with fortitude training, I was begged and pleaded, like people like, give me some, like John's program. John's program have built-in periodization, and the way he suggests people do things, there is auto-regulation built in to some degree. So it's not like he's like, black and white and like only the strong survive type of thing. There's, it varies. It depends on the program, but people begged and pleaded me to come up with some daily trainers. So I probably had 15 people, and like half of them were like hounding me. So like finally I can't, and none of them bought the trainer. People buy it now and again, but no, I mean, it's not like super expensive. I just took a lot of time to do it. But when people ask him, like, it's training wheels. If you need to figure out how to go through the motions, like just like through that the week and then that's cool. You can do that if the money doesn't matter. But the value of my system is it's one set of ingredients from which you can make all sorts of different recipes.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's like you can take sugar and flour and water and oil, and you can make donuts, and you can make pancakes, and you can make cakes and all sorts of things, all sorts of yummy, pastry related carbohydrate full things. And so you can use, I have different volume tiers and I have different frequencies of training just in the 2 basic plans that are out now. And the different set types, you can vary the rep range within those set types. The way you do them, the muscle rounds or the cluster set, people just think fortitude training are muscle rounds. Like, no, that's just one set type. That's just one, but it's a fun one.
Right.
But you can pick that one and go with a heavier load that elicits failure earlier in the muscle round and just stick with the heavy muscle rounds. Or you can use heavy on an exercise that lends itself to that and go lighter on other exercises. Or it could be heavy because a given muscle group tends to do better with heavier training, like your legs or your arms versus your back. And you can progress from the heavier load, feeling earlier in the muscle round, to the later end, if you like, if you love progressive overload and you like to feel like you're moving up in terms of reps. Or if you like to move up in terms of weight, you just move the weight up and you keep the failure point early. So you can, that's just like the one set type.
Right.
So it's kind of like, so you got flour, and we got refined flour, and we have, unrefined flour. And there's all sorts of, tons of different types of flours you can get from various different grains. So you can, it's flour, so my recipe is go get some flour, go do a muscle round, but, use the type of grain that suits your system best.
Yeah, for sure.
And you don't always have to have this grain. You can use barley and wheat and rye, and, if you want to go gluten-free, you can. That's fine by me. Get your amaranth and blah, blah, blah. So those are the basic aspects of, I think a good plan is it has some flexibility.
For sure.
And it's a hard thing to do because our brains are like, no, just tell me what's best. I don't want to have to think in many cases. You're not like that. Obviously you and I are the opposite. We want to think too much probably.
Yeah, exactly. Always trying to tinker when things are going in the right direction. Like, how can I make this a little bit better?
Yeah. I want an A+. Give me an A+. No, exactly. You fucked up. You got a C, dummy. Yeah. All
right, Dr. Scott, I appreciate your time. I don't want to keep you any longer,
man.
because I know you have a lot of stuff going on. But
not that much, but
if you want to kind of give people an idea of where they can follow you and where they can get your stuff, because like I said, those 2 books, especially the Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coaches, everyone always asks what's a book you recommend, and that one just covers the gamut of everything. I mean, there's so many references in that book. You can just go through the references and you'll take 5 years to get through to read all of them.
It took me nearly that long it took me 40 years to get to where I could, or 35 I guess, to get where I could write that. BeYourOwnBodybuildingCoach.com or BYOBBCoach.com. I have multiple URLs. Again, you can find it pretty easily. I've got an Amazon. I don't know if it's I'm trying to do the Amazon store thing, and it's like jumping through all the legalese. But eventually, I have a store. I want to have a kind of a storefront there, so people can get some of the products in the book and those sorts of things, sort of an easier way, because I've got all sorts of little tricks that some of that which I share on my Instagram, which is fortitude_training, or you could just search for Scott Stevenson, you'll find me. But I'm pretty easy. Dr. Scott Stevenson, fortitudetraining.net, Fortitude Training, you'll find me. Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach, you'll find me. And anyone who wants to, I'm a podcast whore, so I'll come on almost anyone's podcast. No offense intended.
None taken.
You're awesome, man. Yeah,
I appreciate it.
So I this is part of my mission, is to try to serve as many people as I can who want to, like, maybe information from my brain. Every once in a while, I have a decent thought, I think.
No,
and hopefully when this pandemic's done, man, I can travel around and start doing some camps and stuff.
Yeah,
What's
definitely.
That?
I was going to say the industry is far better because you're in it, because you're trying to just help people out as much as you can, which is greatly appreciated. I think you do too much stuff for free, to be honest with you. But
I've had some people come down on me like bad, but I don't know. I don't imagine myself lying on my deathbed thinking, man, I should have earned more money.
No, I don't see you as that type of person either.
No.
But yeah, hopefully everything clears up next year and you can get back out there and do some camps. If you do any in Tampa, you have somebody that'll be there for sure. Oh
yeah. We'll do them at the North Powerhouse probably. They just got a new owner.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, but the old owner is still in there. He's there every day.
I figured that would be
changing.
No.
But yeah, hopefully something in Tampa, and I'll get over to the UK. I have a lot of UK listeners. A lot of people there. That's because of Jordan, because he's just done what a good person does, and talked about the fact that we've interacted in the past, and so eventually we'll be back to normal. So hang in there, everybody.
Yes.
If there's also those fun training, go to my Instagram if you are still training at home. You need to. I got trapped in an RV park earlier last year.
I've seen those videos. Yeah.
Those a blast. So if you want some entertainment, like you can see, like, I maybe sound somewhat cerebral here, but I was an absolute knucklehead out in that field, and it was a blast. So enjoy that.
Trees and logs and bands. And
pipes. I'm like, the last day there was this long, like it had to have been like a 30-foot long pipe, and I'm like, I'm deadlifting that motherfucker no matter what. And I did. Eventually I figured out I had to dig it out of the ground because it had been there probably for decades. But so this should all be fun. I guess the bottom line is, like, whatever it is that you do in life, try to do it because you love it.
Yeah.
If you find those things, and this applies to training, the basic here is that if you find a training plan that you really freaking love to do, and it's maybe not optimal, then you're not going to do the one that you don't love. Do the one you love. Find something you love and stick to it. That's what I say.
Perfect. Great way to end it. Appreciate your time, Dr. Scott. Have a great rest of your weekend.
You too, brother.